Hi, I'm Dr. Justine FirnhaberBaker. I teach late medieval history at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. In this video, I'm going to talk to you about a big peasants' revolt that happened in northern France in 1358 called the Jacquerie. And I'm also going to introduce you to an interactive digital map that I made of this revolt. So I'm going to share my screen now so that you can see the map. So this map is located at worldmap.harvard.edu/maps/Jacquerie_1358. And you have the URL there on your screen below this video. This map shows the places mentioned in the sources for the revolt, and it's divided into layers depending on the kind of activity and the participants in the revolt. If you click on the Identify button here, and then click on a particular location, that will bring up information about that location. So we're going to do that now for the city of Senlis, which is just north of Paris here. And when you click on a location, on the left, you can see the different layers that location was involved in. And on the right, you see the sources for it and sometimes some information about what happened there. So for example, if we click on the hometown and residence of the rebels, we can see there's quite a lot of documentation for rebels living at Senlis. If we click on rebel movement, it tells us about one of the Jacquerie leaders who went to Senlis at a certain point. There's a key to the abbreviations used in the annotations in the introduction to the map, which will come up when you click the About button. And then if you scroll down, you see the key to the abbreviations there. There are two main kinds of sources for the Jacquerie. One is chronicles, which are histories written around the time of the revolt, so such as this Chronique des Quatre Premiers Valois. The other is royal pardons, called letters of remission or lettres de remission, that were granted to some of the participants in the Jacquerie and its repression. The annotations identify the sources in the original manuscript or printed edition, and these are in Latin or in Middle French. But some of these sources have been translated into English in the popular protest book by Sam Cohen that is listed in the further resources below this video. So now I'm going to give you a basic outline of what happened in the Jacquerie with the aid of this map. So the Jacquerie didn't come out of nowhere. It was a result of both short-term situations and also long-term historical circumstances. Notably, it occurred almost exactly a decade after the first wave of plague, the Black Death, hit France in 1348. And the plague was an indirect cause of the Jacquerie, and I will come back to it later. But the revolt was more immediately connected to the 100 Years' War, which had been going on between England and France for almost exactly 20 years into 1358. In fact, the Jacquerie got its name from its participants, who called themselves Jacques Bonhomme, meaning James Goodman, which was a term used to describe common-born foot soldiers. And it's actually used, it's usually a derogatory term, but the Jacques seem to have adapted it themselves as a sort of positive, in a positive way to describe themselves. In 1358, when the Jacquerie broke out, this war had been going very badly for the French. 2 years earlier, they had suffered an absolutely stunning defeat at the Battle of Poitiers, where the French king, King Jean, had actually been captured by the English, and he had been taken to London and held for a very large ransom, literally a king's ransom. Many French noblemen had also been captured at Poitiers, and there was a general feeling in France that the French nobility had disgraced itself. that the nobles had run when they ought to have fought, and that they had failed to protect their king and their country. The capture of the French king created a dangerous political situation. In the king's absence, his heir, the Dauphin, Charles, was nominally in charge. Charles would later be known as King Charles the Wise. But when his father was captured in 1356, he was only 18 years old, and frankly, he wasn't very wise, and no one really trusted him to govern. In this power vacuum, a faction arose. This faction was led by the head of the Parisian merchants, a man named Etienne Marcel. Marcel and this faction were deeply critical of the way that France had been governed. They wanted to stamp out corruption, reform the way that money and taxation were handled, and wage the war differently and hopefully with better success. By May 1358, when the Jacquerie broke out, Marcel's faction was nearly at war with the Dauphin Charles. Most of the nobility was supporting the Dauphin, and he was threatening Marcel's base at Paris. So Charles had garrisoned a castle on the River Marne at Meaux, which is here. You can see that Meaux later figures into many of the things that happened in the Jacquerie Revolt. Meaux allowed him to control the Marne River. And down here at Montreux-Fautillon, he garrisoned another castle at the confluence of the Seine and the Yonne rivers. These castles allowed Charles to block supplies from getting to Paris. Because in the Middle Ages, most commercial transport went by river. The last unblocked river was the Oise, north of Paris, which flowed down from what is now Belgium, a place where Marcel and many Parisians had close contacts and allies. Now, on the 28th of May, some noblemen, led by a member of a family loyal to the Dauphin, entered a village on the Oise River called Saint-Leu-d'Esseront. I'm going to zoom in on that village for you now. So that village is here, just a little northwest of Chantilly on the Oise River. Get rid of some of this stuff. These noblemen entering Saint-Leu-d'Esseront were attacked by a large group of villagers from Saint-Leu and neighboring villages. And 9 of them, sorry, I keep pulling that up. Get rid of that again. 9 of these noblemen were killed by these villagers, including this leader who was loyal to the Dauphin. And after that, the Jacquerie sort of explodes. And so this attack at Saint-Leu-d'Esseront has always been considered the beginning of the Jacquerie, and that is quite correct. It was. But this incident was also distinct from the rest of the revolt. It was closely linked with Parisian interests because it involved the Oise River, this river running here. And of course, it also involved this Dauphin loyalist who was killed. Now, we used to think that the reason these noblemen had come to the village of Saint-Leu-d'Esseront was to use a bridge there to blockade the river. But it turns out there wasn't a bridge there. There was supposed to be a bridge built there, but the bridge was actually never built. Instead, the reason that they had come to Saint-Leu, because they're coming from the north here, was to use a ferry on that river to cross to a road on the opposite bank, which led to a big castle just about 2 hours walk up the Oise River at a place named Cré. And that's that green triangle there. The castle at Cré, it's a big, famous old castle, was very similar to those at Meaux and Montreux. And holding it with a proper garrison would have allowed the Dauphin and his noble partisans to control the Oise as they were doing on the Marne at Meaux and the Seine at Montreux. So the attack was meant probably to prevent that happening, to prevent the Dauphin's party from taking Cré. Now, whether the attack at Saint-Lô happened at Marcel's command or on the villagers' own initiative isn't something that we can know now. There just aren't documents to tell us. We don't have sources that say either way. But what we can tell is that as the Jacquerie unfolded over the next 6 weeks, it remained both linked to the Parisian faction and distinct from it. There was further cooperation between Jacques and the Parisians at other places, most notably back here at Meaux, where there was a joint operation, a joint attack on the castle on the Marne River on the 10th of June, where the Jacques and the Parisians and also the citizens of Meaux were spectacularly defeated by a small number of noblemen from the Dauphin's garrison. But most of the Jacquerie was not directly focused on Parisian objectives. Primarily, it was directed against the nobility, and it mostly involved pillaging or destroying nobles' houses and castles. The Jacques didn't kill that many nobles, but they did destroy over 100 of their fortresses. And this gives us an indication of the rebels' motives. The Jacquerie partly came about because of short-term political considerations, this factional conflict and the misgovernance of France. But that political disarray had laid bare underlying social tensions between non-nobles and nobles in the countryside. These tensions were created by longer-term factors, by the combination of the 100 Years' War and the Black Death. The Black Death had greatly reduced the tax base that the crown relied upon to pay for the war. Now, waging a war didn't cost any less after the Black Death, but there were fewer people to pay for it, so they had to be squeezed all the harder. And the taxes that were levied were not levied equally. They were regressive taxes on essential consumption, sales taxes on wine and salt, or taxes that hit income more heavily than they hit wealth. So they affected non-nobles who tended to earn salaries and wages more than they hit nobles who tended to have landed wealth that they could rely upon. And nobles as a class were also sometimes taxed at lower rates altogether, just on the basis that they were already contributing to the war effort by fighting it. But as we recall, the war was not going so well for the French, and the nobles had disgraced themselves especially badly at Poitiers quite recently. So attacking nobles' castles and stealing their possessions makes a lot of sense if we think about the Jacquerie as targeting the nobility both in military and economic terms. And an important thing to note here is that the rebels were targeting nobles. They were not necessarily attacking their own lords. One thing we can see on the map, and I'll zoom out a little bit even more here so you can see just this contrast. So there is some overlap of places where rebels were from and places where they attacked. So these are the purple boxes, this layer here. But most Jacques didn't attack targets in their own hometowns, these blue dots. You can see a lot of these red triangles where they actually did attack things were not where documented Jacks were living. And so this means, among other things, is that the Jacquerie involved a lot of travel. And you can see some of the documented travel in these blue and red lines here, in those layers of movement. And to bring people and villages together like this to attack particular places requires a level of organization. This organization was provided mainly by village captains, as well as another layer above that, village captains, who was coordinating them, which was led by a supreme leader called Guillaume Gal. And there were also massive assemblies where decisions were taken and commands were relayed. So these layers are the rebel leaders here and the rebel assemblies here, those stars. Now, I don't want to overstate the level of coordination. Many rebel actions were autonomous, and there was considerable tension sometimes between what the rank and file wanted to do and what their leaders wanted them to do. So there's actually a lot of conflict within the Jacquerie. But it would be a serious misunderstanding to think of the Jacquerie as an uncontrolled or irrational explosion of mobs just kind of rampaging across the countryside. That wasn't what happened. Over the course of the next 6 weeks, the Jacquerie covered a very large area. And you can see there are even some further echoes very far outside of the Jacquerie heartland in the Ile-de-France and in this part of Champagne here. The Jacquerie lasted until, well into July. But repression and reprisals began already in mid-June, after that big defeat at Meaux and another almost simultaneous one near Clermont in the area around the city of Beauvais, north of Paris. Actions linked to that repression are marked by the green triangles and lines. Some of these reprisals were led by the Dauphin, but many of them involved independent bands of nobles who kind of rampaged across the countryside themselves, again, not in a totally uncontrolled fashion, but there were many complaints, even from other nobles, that their violence was excessive and indiscriminate. And in August, after the Parisian rebellion fell and the Dauphin took back control of Paris, some noblemen had themselves to seek royal pardons for their involvement in the counter-Jacquerie, just as non-nobles had to ask for pardons for participating in the Jacquerie itself. So that just scratches the surface of the Jacquerie revolt. If you'd like to learn more about it, you can consult the further reading listed below. And early next year, I've got a book on it, a whole book on it, coming out with Oxford University Press. So you can check that out then. Thanks for tuning in and stay safe.